To the Black girl who is working hard to heal a mother wound, I see you. Welcome to the Black Girl Seen podcast, where we discuss all things feeling seen, known, and loved. I'm your host, Kaylin Wilson, a licensed clinical social worker and therapist in Atlanta, Georgia. I hope you've been enjoying this month's podcast about understanding and healing from the mother wound. And last week's episode on friendship was a little bit different, but it was still connected to this idea of how your experiencing of being mothered may have impacted you. And today I actually want to dive deeper into that understanding of how the mother wound can show up in our relationships, especially in romance, friendship, and even in our own experience in mothering. So we're going to dive into that today. And before I jump in, I think it's really important to do a quick reminder of the housekeeping that this is not a bashing your mom session. I do still think that this is more aligned with those who maybe had complex, complicated, or painful relationships with their mothers and not just grief. And I think this one actually still captures a little bit more of what it could have been like to have experienced the absence of your mother through loss and had a pleasant relationship with her. So I think this one's a little bit more expansive. That being said, I recognize that we're talking about experiences with mothers and mother figures. And I think this is a great space, if you haven't heard the first episode, to pause and take a step back so that you can kind of couch yourself in what that really means and being able to kind of bend the bounds and confines of what a mother is or what a mother is supposed to be so that you can really show up in the listening of this and knowing that it doesn't necessarily mean your biological mother, and that what we're talking about doesn't necessarily just come from the experiences with mom. Sometimes actually what we're talking about is how the experience of mothering impacted your other relationships with other people in your life. So this is truly not a blame it all on your mom. And if this isn't time or a season in your life where it actually feels really healing to name honestly what that experience was like for you, I see you. And I hope this also resonates with you and gives you some permission to draw that line back to how it impacted your mothering. So let's take a step back and talk about what the mother wound is. I like to describe it as fundamentally a relational injury that can come from the experiences you did or didn't have with your mother. So that may have been things that did happen that caused harm in some way, or things that also didn't happen that could have impacted you. And you essentially have unmet needs. I think most of our woundings are the manifestation of unmet needs. But I think that's a really good way to think about it because it puts into context what we're talking about when we're thinking about the impact of past childhood experiences. This is really also a helpful frame for those of us who are like, it happened, get over it. Why does it matter? Well, outside of being able to quote unquote move on and get over it, which I have thoughts about that, but that's like step 10 of the 12-step process. I do think that there's a way that we disregard the lessons and the imprinting that we received from our experiences in the past just because we want to show that we've quote unquote moved on. So we essentially don't realize that we probably aren't as moved on as we think if we're still repeating things that we learned, or we're still trying to get needs met that we didn't get met when we were younger in the ways that are not actually sustainable, which is what we're going to talk a lot about today. So some of those unmet needs could be the lack of nurturing or closeness, and it could also even be the lack of empowerment or healthy mirroring or boundaries. It can be a lot of things, and we'll dive into that. Where we're going next is how we look at those woundings. We look at the impact of that injury and how it shows up in our relationships, because for some of us, it might be a little obvious, but for a lot of us, it's not. I know for me, it's been a really healing and revealing experience to look up and say, oh, I see where that came from, or, oh, I see how I thought that that was actually effective, but it's not. It's actually not going to benefit me. It's not benefiting other people. It's not really getting to the root of the need that I am trying to meet. For more context, in the last episode, we discussed three avenues, I'd say, of mother wounds that really feel super connected, but it felt important to kind of delineate these themes. And I dived more into it 2 episodes ago. I talked about, firstly, the emotional neglect mother wound. I think this is the most recognizable in terms of the theme, but the impact is sneaky. So this is where you maybe received a lot of the protection, the providing, the care, the food, things of that nature. Not always, but Usually there's an experience that I have my physical and practical needs met, but I don't have my emotional needs met. I don't have the nurturing. I don't get the guidance. I don't get the support. I also maybe don't get the boundaries and the structure. It's also still emotional neglect when we have an overbearing or an overfunctioning parent who then almost like stops our ability to grow our own autonomy, agency, utility, all of that. So these are all things that maybe happen in the background of getting our practical needs met. So that's what makes it sneaky. This shows up a lot when we grow up and we say, well, I had everything I need, or I had a pretty good childhood. I don't really know what's missing. I don't really know why I feel like this. And so this can be recognized with maybe if you had a parent or someone who played a mother figure role for you that was distant, hot and cold, even overbearing. All of those things can support the development of an emotional neglect wound. Then there's a controlling, harmful mother wound. So this can, in some ways, feel like opposites. One is what you didn't receive a lot of, and then the other's the parts that you did experience and receive. And it is what it sounds like, those who maybe suffer physical or emotional abuse and harm. This can also apply to the parent who is hypercritical, which could fall under the umbrella of emotional harm and abuse, just depends on the nature and severity of it. And that can be a piece of ultimately taking away from your psychological safety and your psychological well being. So that still is a piece. The erratic parent, and sometimes it's the product of neglectful parenting that left you in harm's way for another parent to engage or another person in your system to engage and enact harm upon you. So even if that person didn't, the person who participated in the mother figure role for you wasn't enacting harm, sometimes their inability, regardless of the reason, steeped in a lot of understanding or compassion, wherever you fall on that spectrum today, left you exposed for harm. And then we have the abandonment mother wound, which feels almost like a foundation to both of these, which is a form of leaving you in general. And I want to name here that it can be tough to connect to the abandonment wound or the experience of being abandoned if you were not physically left, or if someone did not pass away, or someone did not like literally leave the home or leave you with someone else. We can experience abandonment or a sense of abandonment, even in small and repeated ways. So, constantly being let down, someone with an inconsistent presence. So, they were there sometimes, but not all the time. Someone who maybe could not follow through with their responsibilities. And then again, some of the more obvious ones. So, I want to kind of name that. And that's why I think these are flavors of so many similar experiences, because they really do go back to there was something you needed that I couldn't give you. It's helpful to summarize these or to group these into themes because it can give us some good language and connect with our experiences. And I really do think any of these terms could apply in the other category. This is where sometimes those self help and psychoeducational books or skills groups with a licensed therapist can be really helpful, because sometimes we just don't know. Sometimes we just don't know, and we have a lot of words and we have a lot of therapy language out there. And we're really just trying to find the best way to connect our story. And that could be a great way if you still want to kind of dive into like, what is that? And this is also a great space to like exist in therapy. I think sometimes therapy can just be a space where you explore like, what the heck was that? Right. So after you think about all of these different wounds, it's important to offer yourself some grace and really honor those experiences for yourself, so that you can start to look at your current functioning, your current relationships really differently. This is how we start to draw very different lines to how we show up in friendships, how we show up as a parent yourself, how you show up in the relationship with yourself, because now you have a different sense of what actually taught you, about the world, and about other people. Because that's what we learn in those early dynamics with anyone, let alone our primary caregivers. What feels most important here is to name how it really plants a seed of some harmful messaging that teaches us how to continue to show up in relationships, that might not actually be effective for us, right? Some of those messages that stand out the most to me include the core beliefs of I am not enough, I cannot get my needs met, I am not safe, I have no options or power, and a really big one that could probably be seen as foundational for all the other ones, which is I am not lovable. And what ends up happening, right? And I hope you can connect how this might happen. If you have a mother who was hot and cold with you and you learn to perform to get her attention, you're not going to walk away and be like, gosh, my mom is just like really going through her own thing. Not at age 6, 7, 8. Like you're probably going to internalize that. Not probably, you're definitely, because that's just the way the brain works at those stages of life and internal, unless you have something else coming in to support you, right? Unless we have some other interference going on, we will likely internalize it as I'm not enough, or I have to work really hard, or be perfect to be loved. I think that's another really big one. I have to be perfect. And when we really honor the nature of the experiences we have, then that gives some validity to the things we learned about ourselves and the ways that we continue to show up. And I think it's important to look at that as neutrally as possible. I recognize this might be bringing up a lot of feelings for us. It always brings up feelings for me because I think that we as a society have just kind of really disconnected from anything that hurts us. Like, I think we all just have been taught to move on. And I think this reintegration is so powerful because when you stop thinking like, this is just how I feel versus this is how I was taught to feel, or this is what I learned to feel through experiences. And this is the information that I've been using to make decisions, to understand situations. And I get to use new information now that's probably more true, more real, more appropriate for where I am in my life now. That's a game changer. And that's kind of what I think is most important as we're thinking about topics like this. So when we think about those core beliefs, then we get to think about, well, what are the patterns? What are the things that come out of those messages that I internalized from those woundings with my experience with mothering and being mothered? I like to kind of also categorize these into general themes of over or under functioning. I think that there's a very strong learned response that you have to adjust in some way to get your needs met, depending on how much space was taken up by these harmful or unhelpful or neglectful experiences with the caregiver. I don't think it's fixed. I don't think it's singular. I don't think we're all just one way. I think we all exist on a spectrum. And I think that sometimes we lean in more of one way than the other depending on what we experienced growing up. So if you maybe notice a parent who didn't give enough, then you probably are more of an overfunctioner. Maybe if you had a parent who kind of did a lot and overstepped, you retreated a lot. And it's not always that simple either. I think sometimes when we have really cold parents, we become cold. Sometimes when we have overfunctioning parents, we do the same. So that's why I want to name like it's not I think very few things outside of like math have, which even that is not always as straight and narrow as we were taught it was. So I think there's a lot of nuance here that we have a lot of wisdom to decipher for ourselves. So in the over functioning behavior cluster, we ultimately put our needs aside and then work really hard for love, acceptance, belonging, and for the crumbs of our needs to get met that we can. On the under functioning side, we also put our needs aside, but then we work really hard to not need that love, acceptance, belonging. Newsflash, spoiler alert, it's not sustainable. It's sometimes not effective. It can be effective in some ways, sometimes, but it usually has unintended consequences that in the long run are not helpful. So, on the over functioning side, that's where you have that active people pleasing, where you are overgiving, you're over accommodating, you are over loving, right? You are showing up tenfold, you are doing whatever it is that you sense you need to do to help people feel the way you want them to feel so that you feel safe in the relationship. And I think there have been a lot of really honest and challenging but beautiful conversations about how people pleasing actually doubles as manipulation. And I think because we only learned about manipulation from a perspective of I hold power and I use it to abuse or control someone. And it's like I have power over you. And typically maybe I'm the person who appears more powerfully presenting and Maybe I'm more of like out the externally or physically harmful person. We don't always think about how that same thing can happen in a way that's more passive, in a way that actually has the best of intentions, maybe. Because, when you think about it, like wanting your parent to be happy so that you feel okay is not an inherently terrible thing. And it doesn't mean that you are still showing up in a way where you are being inauthentic and you are being mindful and intentional in a way that is ultimately deceptive, right? To share information that helps a situation go in your favor. And maybe I'll do a whole nother talk on that, but I really think there's some great talks on that already that exist that I want folks to continue to lean into. And this might be controversial, but I actually think this is an empowering thing to learn, because when you learn that your people pleasing is still a form of manipulation, in the sense that this is still a form of wanting to control others, it actually speaks to the fact that you have more power than you think. Because I think sometimes when we engage in these behaviors, when we are people who have been on the other side and the receiving side of harm, we feel so powerless and we forget that, like, we're using our power. We just might not be using it in the best ways. So we still do have impact. We don't have control. None of us do. We think we do. But we do have impact. We do have a way to show up and we have a choice in it. And so we get to use that power, but just differently. So that's kind of a segue into a different topic that I felt was important to name here, because it can be tough to hear these behaviors that I'm about to keep listing and think of it as like, well, what else am I supposed to do? Right? Because they feel powerless, but they actually are. They actually are. So next we have perfectionism. That's your overachieving, overworking, quote unquote, toxic productivity, or the workaholism. I'm using more air quotes. That's that relentless pursuit, effortless perfection. That is another form of like, I will remain on the treadmill with the hopes of one day doing enough, which doesn't exist, in order to earn love, safety, support, acceptance, belonging. Then we have caretaking. And I haven't talked as much about this, but I also think that this is a really important one to break down one day. Caring for someone and caretaking for someone, two totally different things. In caretaking, we assume roles that other people can do for themselves. And I want to kind of juxtapose this with caregiving. This is not hard science, but this is more of what I'm saying in this. I'm using these two terms very differently because they can be used interchangeably. But in this particular dynamic, when we're talking about relational roles, a caregiver has stepped up to care for someone who cannot care for themselves in some way. Caring for someone is something that we can all do. And in fact, I think we all need to do a little bit more. Caretaking really disrespects the boundary between the both of them, right? It dismisses that boundary. Caretaking is when you are now doing the emotional labor for someone else, or you've got that savior complex, or you've taken on a provider and protector role in a relationship in a way that's unfair to you. Your needs are completely pushed aside and you're stepping up and doing things for others that they are actually capable of doing themselves. And that's another really tricky thing that gets a lot into the codependent science, or the science in the world of codependence. And I think what's important to name here is that you are now showing up in a way that assumes responsibility for other people's stuff that feels like is a ticket to being loved, cared, and accepted. And again, unintended consequences, and it's not sustainable. And then I want to talk a little bit more about the behaviors that are more anxious and reactive. So this is where we kind of just live in that braced state. We're constantly worried and we might engage in a lot of reactive behaviors in order to protect our position in a relationship. We're ultimately almost always afraid, worried, or triggered, and we are reacting and responding from that space because it feels safer to work really hard to keep our spot in a relationship than it does to kind of trust that we can do that in another way. And so that might look like all of the protesting and the reassurance seeking, those emotional roller coasters, the bids of care, and the please don't leave, or the I'm actually going to kick you out first so that you don't leave me, but then now I want you back. Like, that's where some of those behaviors can kind of show up as well. On the under functioning side, this is where you put your needs aside and you work hard to not need love, support, care, acceptance, belonging. this is where you probably learn like less is more. And I want to name that there are a lot of people who kind of engage in these behaviors pretty regularly and can look like really stable or secure people, but it's really just that there's a lot of absence, there's a lot of retreat going on. And I think this can still be true for some of our over functioning people. I think sometimes when maybe you like do a lot and you show up for a lot of people, and then when it comes to your emotional needs, we're kind of like really dissociated from it. And then we kind of just like don't engage in any of the connection building behaviors. Like that is still its own form of underfunctioning. So that's something to pay attention to. That's why I want to name to be careful about putting yourself in one category over the other. A lot of us engage in both, especially when we're thinking about different dynamics. There are some people who like, there's a lot of emotional avoidance in their friendships and maybe even romance. But with parenting, that's where you feel safe to engage in your over functioning behaviors because your kid, quote unquote, can't leave you. So it's safer to kind of push, push, push and give and overstep and all of that, knowing that that kid won't go anywhere or that you can kind of like actually seek your needs. It feels like that, right? Because that's not the appropriate place to seek all of those needs, but it might feel safer to do that there versus with the other adults in your life who it feels like they do have the autonomy to leave. And sometimes it happens in the opposite. Sometimes we feel very worried or anxious about what it looks like to be over involved in our child's lives. And so then we are a little more withdrawn and we don't make assumptions about what our kids need because we knew what we didn't need or we thought things were too much. But then maybe we're over functioning in our friendships and we're giving a lot there because for some reason that feels safer to do. So that's why this takes so much good, long, reflective work, ideally with a trained and licensed professional who can walk along this journey with you because it's just not black and white. So some of those under functioning behaviors look like emotional avoidance, shutting down, avoiding conflict, numbing your emotions, resisting or pushing back against intimacy. Then you also have people pleasing in this category, but it's passive. So this is more the folks who maybe really engage in intense fawning behaviors with a hint of learned helplessness. So this is when you're engaging with someone and they've become upset. You're probably in a trigger, but instead of thinking, oh, can I buy this for you? Can I take you to the airport? Can I do your hair? Can I do something? Can I give you something to make you feel better? Instead, it's, I'm so sorry. I can't do anything right. Whatever you need, whatever you want, whatever you need. And it might even be, oh, I know you don't want to be my friend anymore. Like, maybe I'm just not even good enough to be your friend. And then there's the hypercritical part jumps out and it's externalized. And then the other person then can feel pulled in to then pick up the pieces for you and then start doing your emotional work for you and then maybe start reassuring you, right? So it's a bit of a passive way to pull someone in to help you feel comfortable and safe again. And I hope that as people are listening that there's no pathology here. These are like being really neutral here can be so powerful because we all might do it in one way or the other. We may not notice it, or maybe we used to do it and we don't do it anymore, but maybe now we can connect with where there were some breakdowns in the past because we did engage in that before. So lots of compassion as we're listening. Because I think sometimes when we discuss this side of it, this side I think can actually really internalize a lot of language about what they're not. If you're you know, if you kind of fall under the umbrella of predominantly an underfunctioning type, I think the world is not as kind to those folks and to those behaviors versus the overfunctioning type. It's like, well, at least you're like a high powered executive or something. It's like you did something right with your life, not realizing like you're still just as burned out and in pain and empty as the next person. So I just wanted to kind of name that. Speaking of being a high powered executive, is the procrastination piece and the underperforming piece from a perspective of resisting discomfort and resisting effort because of an intense fear of failure. So this is more of a stalling of process that can happen as protection. So I'm not talking about you're lazy, you're not, that's not what I'm talking about. In fact, that's what it can end up looking like, and that's not what it is. This is where the strategy becomes if I don't try, I won't mess up and I can stay safe. So this might come from the mothering where you were criticized so much that it just became safer to stop trying. It became safer to not put yourself out there in those ways. So sometimes when we're navigating a childhood and early life where we're like, I was super shy or I wasn't really motivated, Sometimes it was your brain protecting you from more criticism. This also can be a little bit of a protest around, like, I did so much when I was younger that now I don't want to anymore. So this can be its own way of like taking power back and kind of naming, like, I'm not going to take on those roles anymore. And that it maybe was a bit of an overcorrection. And so now you recognize that you're not functioning in the same ways in your life. And I think this is really powerful for those of us who maybe feel like we're not where we want to be in life, or we're not functioning in the ways that we thought we would, or we have these dreams but we feel so far away from it. Or maybe those of us who are in fields that have nothing to do with what we're really passionate about. And there's a way that our protective systems can show up and say, like, just chill out, sit down, be in a corner, like, just get through it, instead of like, how can you actually grow and thrive and do what you want to do? And that might be a direct response to our experiences in early life, and not just like being on the wrong path and something being wrong. And the last one that feels like a bit of this is like learned helplessness and learned powerlessness. So deferring responsibilities to others, refusing to be responsible in a protective effort to not risk blame, shame, and failure because it's too painful. And so I'm wrapping my arms around a lot of us, because I think that if you heard something that you do, a way that you show up that you recognize you don't want to show up that way, I hope you can see how much it was actually keeping you safe for so long. Right. So, and I can break down some scenarios where we might not recognize that we're doing something that has the intention of helping us feel safe, be safe, stay in relationship, but then it has unintended consequences over time. So what can that look like now? So maybe for some of us, we learned to overfunction, always take the lead. We're the leader. We're the one with the itinerary on the group trips, or we're always the designated driver, right? And then we don't always recognize how we've communicated to others that we don't need them, or that we don't want them to lead, or there's just lack of room for others to contribute. But then we then feel resentful because we feel alone and abandoned, and like everything's on our shoulders. And so then that cycle can repeat. Maybe for some of us who engage in a lot of people pleasing and a lot of fawning behaviors, we don't recognize always when we're communicating to other people, like, I need you to make me feel good all the time. I need you to take care of me emotionally. And so then others might feel a little overwhelmed by that and feel like a sense of like, it's like we either have power over or under, like we're constantly dancing with that control that I said we don't always notice that we do have when we're people pleasing. And then there's no real intimacy established because we're not connecting. We're just power struggling, and that can create very easy fissures, very easy breaks and relationship breakdowns. Then we experience rejection, or we feel controlled. And then we feel once again like, I have to earn people's love. So I have to please all the time. And then maybe if we have some learned helplessness, maybe we then don't feel safe enough to step up in ways that would actually help us feel more confident and know that we are more autonomous individuals, that we can participate interdependently in this world. And so then folks may have an experience of feeling overly responsible for us. Not that they are, but that maybe there's an experience of it. And maybe then there's an experience of burdening. Not that we're not burdens, but that there's an experience of that. And so then others might feel like they don't have the capacity to, or the desire to care for us or to show up for us. So then we feel on one end, we feel like we're too much. And then it kind of just repeats the cycle. So I hope that kind of paints a picture of how this all wraps together. And so then we get to the part of like, now what the hell do I do? And I hope that, again, we can remember, like, if these are unsustainable ways of showing up, can we then just work on new ways? And it's not that easy, but it is that simple. We do get to choose new ways to show up. Ultimately, what we get to do by honoring all of these truths, what happened, what that left in us, how that shows up now. We were taught to think less of ourselves, to put ourselves down, to control others in order to get our needs met, to stop trying because failure is worse than never trying. We learned all those things, or we were taught them directly. And now that we recognize that, we can see ourselves more malleable and more capable of unlearning some things and relearning others. Right. And then we can start to get curious about how we can show up in those more sustainable behaviors. If we are so used to taking on all of the work in a relationship, can we slowly start to dial it back? if we learn to people please, which I didn't say this earlier, but I just really love the quote, like, are the people pleased? And the answer is usually no. Like, usually it just doesn't work. It doesn't work in the ways we want it to. Can we focus less on seeking a reaction or seeking an experience for someone else versus actually communicating how we really feel, what we really need, and trusting other people to be okay? Some of our work is not even about how much we need to do. Some of it is about how much we get to stop doing and how much we get to trust other people to hold their own discomfort. So much of what we learn in the dynamics with painful mothering or caregiving or early life experiences teaches us that we have to step up and help other people feel and be and do what we need them to do so that we can feel safe. When you're a kid, that's kind of true. If mom's depressed, you don't eat. So if mom's happy and entertained, you might eat. That might be so true. But today, if your neighbor is not happy, you can still eat. And there are people out there who do not need you to hold so much of that. That doesn't mean don't be good community. It's just that we can recognize that we are not as integral as to other people's functioning as we think in that way. We don't have to do it for people. We just get to be there with people and through things with people. But we do get to trust them to do it themselves. And when we allow them the discomfort of feeling in their emotions and being disappointed when you set a boundary and being inconvenienced when you have a need, and then they do the same with you, then everyone's needs starts getting met because now we're refocusing our energy on things we actually have the power to impact, right? Instead of trying to avoid conflict because it's too scary and we don't want to go through a breakup, we can actually communicate what we need and figure out if the partner or the person or the relationship is actually good for us instead of just frantically trying to make sure it doesn't fall apart. So, like I said, much easier said than done. And I think I always say it's almost always easier said than done, but it can be done. So, if you're looking for a process to kind of support this for you, it's helpful to kind of think of it as starting off with getting clear on how you might be acting out some of these early life wounds. Just like we talked through before, really piecing together like, where might this be coming from? What am I really doing here? Is it really just that everyone always does this, or is there a way that I'm participating in this dynamic? Then be curious about how you actually try to get your needs met. And if it's protective, which is you defending against a feared outcome, or if it's proactive, which is moving you towards a hoped for outcome, because there's a huge difference there. Right? So people pleasing is protective and it's defensive. I just don't want them to be mad at me. I just don't want them to be disappointed in me. But healthy needs expression and emotional boundaries and compromise, that's proactive because it's you saying, I want to actually experience connection with these people. I want to share my needs. And I also want to allow others to feel however they feel about it and listen to their needs. And then we both can come to terms about how both of our needs can be considered here. That's you moving toward the goal of, I want folks to have space in this relationship, including me, versus just like, I just don't want people to be mad. I just don't want people to be upset. Controlling energy is protective. I don't want anyone to control me, or I don't ever want to feel unsafe or out of control. On the flip side, having healthy boundaries as well as help seeking behaviors and resilience is proactive, right? Because we get to say, I have a capacity to keep myself as safe as possible. I have the right to assert my boundaries. And I recognize that life inevitably is going to bring moments where my safety might be compromised. I wish that the world was completely safe, but there's a difference between actual safety around you and an experience of safety, which is a process where you can seek support and return to safety, even when you're in a space that's not safe, right? And there's a lot of nuance there, but I do think it's important to name because in some ways, we might not always feel very safe in a relationship. We may not be safe in a relationship, but seeking to control in order to prevent that experience is not sustainable. Showing up with your boundaries and trusting that you can find community and spaces to support you in the event that that happens is very different. And that's where you can show up to a relationship more open without bringing those protective strategies that might then co create the experiences that you don't want to have. So some other questions too that you can reflect on, and it's similar to the ones we asked in the beginning and 2 episodes ago, where we were reflecting on the nature of mother wounds. We get to ask ourselves, what rules are we living by that we can let go of now? We get to ask ourselves, what did we learn about ourselves that no longer fit and is no longer needed for survival? And we get to ask ourselves how we can continue to hold compassion for how you learn to show up, even as you continue to unlearn and relearn different things. This is not the time to beat up on yourself for people pleasing. This is not the time to say, I just need to stop being a perfectionist. There's a way that we then start to perfectionize our healing so it doesn't really go away. So how can we at least hold compassion for, like, it makes sense that I've shown up in this way and I get to show up differently now. So in a way, a lot of this I think can be summarized in start writing the present story. So at the end of the last episode about mother wounds, I said, start writing the whole story. Tell yourself more of what happened. This time I want to say, start writing the present story. Let's start noticing what's actually going on right here and not just through the purview and the lens of the past. We can start there so that we can know why it feels the way it feels and what we're doing and why we might be doing it. And let's also then start planting our feet in the present and writing that story instead. Thank you for journeying with me. I'm also going to talk a little bit more about paternal and father wounds in the upcoming episodes as we transition to the summer months and we get into the next upcoming holiday. So thank you for walking with me around some tough topics that I think we also are having like a nice reckoning with about what we want to do in our lives, depending on those experiences and our relationships to those wounds. So if you liked this episode and the last one, you might want to share this one in pairs. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and rate the podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the Scene Sunday newsletter, where I share a little bit more about the episode, including some blog posts. And I'm always letting you know when the next episode drops. So be sure to share the love and come back to this when you need a reminder and a good hug. And to the Black girl who is unlearning the painful ways that your relationship with mothering has impacted you, I see you. And I wish you the space to relearn healthy relating safely and lean into the story of you that heals. Take care. Thanks for tuning in to the Black Girl Scene podcast. This podcast is meant for information purposes only and is not meant to substitute for medical advice. Although I'm a licensed therapist, this podcast does not establish a clinical relationship with you, the listener, nor does it replace a relationship with a licensed mental health professional. For more information and resources on finding a therapist or support, please visit www.blackgirlscene.com/support.